Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps the family table would feel less crowded if you sat with the neighbors instead, my daughter-in-law said with a smile so polished that anyone hearing her might have mistaken it for kindness. She had chosen her words carefully. That was what made them hurt. Easter Sunday had always been my favorite holiday. The first signs of spring, fresh lilies lining the church altar, children racing across green lawns searching for brightly colored eggs, and families gathering around long tables filled with baked ham, scalloped potatoes, deviled eggs, buttery dinner rolls, and my homemade carrot cake. For more than 30 years, I had hosted Easter brunch for the Whitmore family. Every centerpiece, every folded linen napkin, every hand-painted egg had once passed through my hands. This year, however, I arrived at my son Daniel's beautiful colonial-style home carrying only a covered glass dish of cinnamon rolls and the quiet hope that spending time together might feel normal again. The house buzzed with conversation before I even stepped through the front door. Children laughed in the backyard while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers. The scent of fresh flowers mixed with roasted ham floated through the open foyer. Vanessa greeted guests in a pale pink designer dress that matched the tulips decorating the dining room. She looked every bit the perfect hostess, smiling effortlessly as friends from church complimented her decorations. When she noticed me, she walked over with graceful confidence and kissed the air beside my cheek. "Happy Easter, Eleanor," she said warmly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Thank you for coming." The words sounded welcoming. Her eyes told another story. I handed her the baking dish. "I brought the cinnamon rolls Daniel always loved." "How thoughtful," she replied before quietly placing the dish on a side counter, far away from the dining table where every other homemade contribution had already been arranged. It was such a small gesture that no one else seemed to notice. I did. I noticed everything. As more guests arrived, I made my way toward the dining room. The long oak table was beautifully decorated with white china, crystal glasses, pastel ribbons, and tiny ceramic rabbits nestled among fresh greenery. Every place setting carried a handwritten name card. I scanned the table once. Then twice. My name wasn't there. For a brief second, I wondered whether I'd overlooked it. Vanessa appeared beside me almost instantly, as though she had been waiting for that exact moment. "Oh," she said with an apologetic laugh, "I had to make a few last-minute adjustments. We thought it would be easier if you sat at the smaller table near the sunroom. Some of our younger guests wanted to stay together." She pointed toward a round folding table tucked near the windows. Two elderly neighbors I barely knew were already seated there beside a distant cousin who spent most holidays looking at his phone. It wasn't about the chair. It never is. It was about the message. After decades at the center of every Whitmore Easter, I had quietly been moved to the edge of the room. Daniel glanced over from across the table. Our eyes met for barely a second before he looked away and pretended to help refill coffee cups. That hurt more than Vanessa's carefully rehearsed smile. My granddaughter Lily hurried over, her ponytail bouncing as she wrapped her arms around my waist. "Grandma Eleanor, I saved an egg for you to hide with me later." Before I could answer, Vanessa gently touched Lily's shoulder. "Sweetheart, let Grandma rest. She's probably tired after driving all this way." I had driven exactly 18 miles. Lily looked confused but nodded politely before following her mother back toward the backyard. I smiled anyway. Years have a way of teaching you that dignity is often measured by the words you choose not to say. So I thanked the neighbors at my new table, unfolded my napkin, and listened as conversations continued without me. Around the room, I heard laughter, clinking glasses, and stories about vacations, promotions, and school achievements. No one asked about my life. No one asked how I had been since my retirement. I watched quietly, noticing details that others missed, the quick glances Vanessa exchanged with Daniel, the subtle way she directed every conversation, the confidence of someone absolutely certain she controlled the room. She believed today marked the moment she had finally replaced me as the heart of the Whitmore family. If only she understood what my late husband and I had quietly built decades earlier. Across the room, the front door opened, and an older gentleman in a charcoal suit stepped inside carrying a slim leather portfolio. Benjamin Rhodes met my eyes for only a heartbeat before giving the smallest nod imaginable. Inside that portfolio rested documents no one else at Easter even knew existed, and as Vanessa lifted her glass to welcome the family, she had no idea that every future she imagined for the Whitmores still depended on a single signature that had not yet touched a single page. I watched Benjamin remove his coat and greet several guests before he quietly accepted a cup of coffee from one of the servers. To everyone else, he was simply an old family attorney stopping by to wish us a happy Easter. No one seemed surprised to see him. Benjamin had attended birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, and holiday dinners for years. He had known my late husband, Charles, since they were both young associates trying to build careers in Boston. Familiarity made people overlook him. That was exactly how Benjamin preferred it. I folded my hands neatly in my lap and listened as conversations flowed around the room. Vanessa had a remarkable gift for controlling attention without appearing obvious. She complimented one guest's new kitchen renovation, congratulated another on a promotion, and somehow managed to steer every discussion back toward herself. Whenever someone mentioned family traditions, she smiled graciously and accepted praise as though she had personally created every custom the Whitmores had cherished for generations. There was a time when I might have corrected the record. Age teaches a different lesson. Recognition fades, but character remains. Across the room, Daniel finally approached my table carrying a fresh cup of coffee. He hesitated before placing it beside me. "How are you doing, Mom?" he asked quietly. I smiled gently. "I am enjoying watching everyone together." He nodded, although his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Vanessa worked really hard putting all of this together. She certainly did. My answer was truthful. She had worked hard. She had also worked patiently over the past several years, replacing traditions one by one. First, she insisted Christmas dinners rotate between homes. Then she volunteered to organize Thanksgiving. After that came birthdays, family reunions, and now Easter. None of those changes seemed significant alone. Together, they slowly shifted the center of the family away from shared history and toward her own carefully managed image. Daniel looked as though he wanted to say something more, but Vanessa called his name from the dining room. "Daniel, could you help carve the ham?" she asked brightly. He gave me an apologetic smile before walking away without another word. I watched him leave and remembered the little boy who used to hide behind my legs on his first day of school because he was afraid of meeting strangers. Somewhere along the way, confidence had been replaced by constant compromise. The meal began with prayer. Vanessa stood at the head of the main table, thanking everyone for coming and expressing gratitude for family, blessings, and new beginnings. Several guests complimented her beautiful hosting. Someone joked that she had become the true matriarch of the Whitmore family. Laughter circled the room. I noticed Daniel force a smile while lowering his eyes toward his plate. Benjamin happened to glance in my direction at that exact moment. His expression remained calm, but he lightly tapped one finger against the leather portfolio resting beside his chair before returning to his conversation. It was such a subtle gesture that no one else could have noticed it. I understood immediately. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. The thought brought me no joy. Only clarity. Halfway through lunch, Lily quietly slipped away from the children's table and climbed into the empty chair beside me. "Grandma Eleanor," she whispered, "did I do something wrong? Mommy keeps telling me to stay with the other kids." I reached over and gently brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "You did absolutely nothing wrong, sweetheart." She looked relieved. "I wanted you to see the Easter basket I made at church." Before she could continue, Vanessa appeared once again wearing the same flawless smile she showed every guest. "Lily, honey, everyone is getting ready for the egg hunt. Come on." Lily looked at me hopefully. "Can Grandma come?" Vanessa laughed softly. "Grandma would probably rather relax inside while the younger people run around outside." Lily reluctantly climbed down and followed her mother toward the backyard, turning twice to wave at me before disappearing through the patio doors. I waved back until she could no longer see me. Sometimes exclusion does not arrive through harsh words. Sometimes it arrives disguised as consideration. As plates were cleared away, guests began wandering into the backyard where hundreds of colorful eggs had been hidden among flower beds and beneath maple trees. I remained seated for another moment, enjoying the peaceful sunlight pouring through the windows. Benjamin walked past my chair without stopping. In a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "The board members have all confirmed. They are waiting only for your instruction." Then he continued outside as though we had never spoken. My heartbeat remained steady, but I knew something important had just shifted. Across the lawn, Vanessa raised her phone to capture photographs of smiling children and laughing relatives, completely unaware that before the afternoon ended, a single conversation could quietly change the future she believed she already owned. The children scattered across the backyard with woven baskets swinging from their arms while adults gathered beneath the covered patio, balancing coffee cups and dessert plates as conversations drifted between gardening, church events, and summer vacation plans. I stepped outside slowly, letting the warm April breeze carry the scent of blooming dogwoods across the lawn. Lily spotted me almost immediately. She smiled and started running toward me before stopping halfway. Vanessa gently placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered something that I could not hear. Lily's cheerful expression faded, and she quietly turned back toward the other children. I looked away before she could see the disappointment on my face. Sometimes protecting a child means refusing to make her choose between the adults she loves. I had spent enough years raising a family to understand that children often carry burdens they never created. Benjamin stood near the garden fence speaking with an older gentleman I recognized as Harold Bennett, one of the independent trustees who had served alongside my late husband for nearly 2 decades. Harold had attended family gatherings only a handful of times over the years, and even then he rarely stayed long. Most of the guests assumed he was simply another retired family friend. They had no reason to think otherwise. Vanessa walked toward them carrying a tray of lemonade with effortless confidence. "Mr. Bennett, I do not believe we have officially met," she said warmly. Harold smiled politely. "I have known the Whitmore family for many years." "Well, then you already know how much family means to me," Vanessa replied. "Daniel and I are looking forward to carrying the traditions forward for the next generation." Harold glanced toward me for only a brief moment before answering, "Traditions survive only when people remember who built them." Vanessa laughed lightly, apparently believing he was complimenting her. "Exactly," she answered before moving on to greet another guest. Harold remained silent until she was safely out of earshot. As he walked past me, he nodded almost imperceptibly. "She has absolutely no idea," he murmured before continuing toward the patio. His words lingered in my mind much longer than they lasted in the air. I remained beside the flower beds, watching the children search beneath shrubs and behind stone planters for brightly painted eggs. Lily eventually found a golden egg hidden beneath an old maple tree. She looked around instinctively, searching for me before proudly lifting it into the air. I clapped softly, and her smile returned for a moment. Daniel joined me a few minutes later, hands tucked into his pockets. "Mom, I wanted to apologize if the seating arrangement made you uncomfortable," he said quietly. There were more guests than Vanessa expected. I looked at him. Gently. "Do you truly believe there was no room at the family table?" His shoulders lowered slightly. He did not answer immediately. "Things have just been different lately." "Yes," I replied. "They have." He rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he had carried since childhood whenever he felt trapped between honesty and convenience. "Vanessa wants everyone to move forward. She thinks new traditions help families grow." "New traditions are not the problem," I answered calmly. "Forgetting gratitude is." Daniel looked down at the grass without speaking. Before either of us could continue, Benjamin approached carrying his leather portfolio. "Daniel," he said pleasantly, "it has been far too long. Congratulations on another successful year at the firm." Daniel smiled politely and shook his hand. "Thank you, Ben. It is always good seeing you." Benjamin nodded. "Your father would have been proud." Those simple words changed Daniel's expression. My husband had passed away 6 years earlier, yet hearing his father mentioned still softened something inside him. Benjamin opened the portfolio just enough to remove a sealed ivory envelope. For one brief second, Daniel noticed the embossed crest stamped into the corner. "What is that?" he asked casually. Benjamin closed the portfolio again before answering. "Just a few estate documents requiring Mrs. Whitmore's review at a later time." Daniel accepted the explanation without another question, but I saw curiosity settle quietly behind his eyes. That tiny moment mattered more than he realized. Across the lawn, Vanessa had been watching us. She smiled at another guest while pretending not to pay attention, yet I noticed how quickly her gaze returned to Benjamin's portfolio. Her confidence had not disappeared, but for the first time all afternoon, uncertainty slipped into her expression. She walked toward us carrying 3 glasses of iced tea. "Everything all right over here?" she asked cheerfully. Benjamin accepted a glass with perfect composure. "Everything is exactly as it should be." Vanessa laughed politely, although something in her eyes searched his face for meaning. She found none. Benjamin had spent 40 years practicing law. Revealing emotion was never part of his profession. Moments later, several guests gathered everyone together for a large family photograph in front of the blooming magnolia tree. Vanessa naturally positioned herself beside Daniel at the center of the group while directing everyone else where to stand. I quietly took my place near the back without complaint. Just before the camera flashed, Harold Bennett spoke loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. "Mrs. Whitmore, perhaps you should stand closer to the center. After all, without you, none of us would be here today." An awkward silence settled over the group. Vanessa's smile stiffened ever so slightly, Daniel turned toward me with visible confusion, and Benjamin lowered his eyes as though waiting for the next move in a game only a handful of people even knew had begun. The photographer lowered his camera after taking several more pictures, but the brief silence Harold had created did not disappear as quickly as the smiles returned. Most of the guests simply assumed he had been paying me a polite compliment because I was the oldest member of the family. Vanessa recovered almost instantly, laughing softly as she thanked everyone for coming and suggesting that coffee and dessert be served on the back patio. She had spent years learning how to redirect uncomfortable moments before anyone asked questions. It was one of the reasons so many people admired her. Confidence often looks like leadership until someone discovers what it is built upon. I accepted a cup of coffee and wandered toward the edge of the garden where Charles had planted 3 flowering dogwood trees nearly 20 years earlier. Standing there always brought me back to the spring afternoon when he first shared an idea that sounded almost impossible. Daniel had just graduated from college, and Charles looked across our backyard and said, "We can leave our children money, Eleanor, or we can leave them stability. Those are not always the same thing." At the time, I did not fully understand what he meant. Over the following 2 years, we met with financial advisors, estate planners, accountants, and Benjamin Rhodes more times than I could count. Every meeting lasted hours. Every decision was debated carefully. We did not build a fortune because we expected our family to become wealthy forever. We built a structure that could protect future generations from reckless decisions, unexpected hardship, and short-term thinking. Charles believed money should create opportunity, never entitlement. I believed character should always matter more than inheritance. Together, we insisted that every document reflect those values. Benjamin had often smiled at our determination, telling us that most families only worried about dividing assets after someone passed away. We wanted something different. We wanted our family's future guided by principles instead of emotions. That meant creating an independent trust with professional oversight, annual reviews, educational funding for future grandchildren, emergency medical reserves, and charitable commitments that reflected the values Charles and I had shared throughout our marriage. Most importantly, the trust appointed a lifetime protector with authority to approve major decisions whenever circumstances threatened the family's long-term interests. Charles had insisted that role belonged to me. I argued against it for weeks. He never changed his mind. "You see people more clearly than I do," he told me one evening while we sat on our front porch watching the sunset. "You notice what they become after they believe nobody is paying attention." Those words returned to me now as I watched Vanessa laughing with guests beside the dessert table. She genuinely believed she had earned complete control over the Whitmore family's future simply because she organized holidays well, managed social appearances gracefully, and influenced Daniel's daily decisions. She had never asked how the family foundation operated. She had never attended the annual trustee meetings. She had never shown interest in the quiet work that preserved everything beneath the surface. She assumed those responsibilities had disappeared with Charles. That assumption had become her greatest weakness. Lily wandered over carrying a small paper bag filled with colorful plastic eggs. "Grandma Eleanor," she asked softly, "Grandpa Charles planted these trees, did not he?" I smiled. "He did. He said every spring should remind us that strong roots stay hidden." She looked thoughtfully at the trunk before placing one tiny painted egg beside the flowers. "Then maybe I will always remember him when these bloom." Before I could answer, Vanessa called Lily from across the yard, reminding her that everyone was gathering for dessert. Lily hugged me quickly before running back toward the patio. I remained beneath the trees for another minute, thinking about Charles and the promise we had quietly made to each other all those years ago. We had never wanted our children to compete over money. We wanted them to protect one another long after we were gone. That promise still mattered. Benjamin approached carrying 2 coffee cups and handed one to me without saying anything at first. We stood together watching guests laugh around the long patio table. Finally, he spoke in a calm voice. "Mrs. Whitmore, there has been one unexpected development." I turned toward him. Benjamin almost never described anything as unexpected. "One of the trustees requested that the family be informed sooner than originally planned," he said carefully. "He believes delaying the conversation any longer could create unnecessary complications." I considered his words while looking toward Daniel, who was helping refill lemonade pitchers, completely unaware that the course of his afternoon might soon change forever. "Do you agree with him?" I asked. Benjamin paused before answering. "Professionally, I believe the documents can wait until tomorrow. Personally, after what I witnessed today, I am no longer certain waiting serves anyone." Before I could respond, Harold Bennett began walking toward us from the patio carrying a sealed envelope identical to the one inside Benjamin's portfolio, and the expression on his face told me that someone else had already decided the timetable was about to change. Harold stopped a few feet away from Benjamin and me, holding the sealed envelope with both hands as though he understood its weight had very little to do with the paper inside. He greeted me warmly before lowering his voice. "Mrs. Whitmore, I apologize for arriving at a family celebration with business on my mind, but after watching today's events, I felt it would be irresponsible to remain silent." I studied his expression carefully. Harold was not a man given to dramatic decisions. During the 20 years we had worked together, he had built his reputation on patience and measured judgment. If he believed something required immediate attention, there was always a reason. Before I could answer, laughter erupted from the patio as Vanessa invited everyone to gather for dessert. She stood beside the beautifully decorated table, slicing carrot cake while complimenting each guest with effortless charm. Anyone visiting for the first time would have believed she was the heart of the Whitmore family. That illusion had taken years to build. It had not happened overnight. Harold glanced toward the patio before speaking again. "One of the younger trustees contacted me this morning. He mentioned hearing conversations suggesting that future decisions regarding the family trust would soon be redirected." I remained perfectly still. Redirected by whom? Harold hesitated only briefly. He believed Mrs. Carter had been telling several relatives that, after this year, everything important would naturally pass through her and Daniel. Benjamin folded his arms calmly. "She has been making similar remarks for several months." None of this surprised me. Confidence often grows fastest when it is never challenged. I had heard whispers before. Distant cousins mentioning that Vanessa planned to modernize family traditions. Friends casually assuming she already managed the charitable foundation Charles and I had established. I simply had not realized how widely those assumptions had spread. Across the yard, Lily waved excitedly for me to join everyone for dessert. I smiled and waved back before beginning the slow walk toward the patio with Benjamin and Harold beside me. As we approached, Vanessa looked up and flashed another polished smile. There you are, Eleanor. I was just telling everyone that next year we might host Easter at the country club instead. It is probably time for the family to move towards something a little more elegant. Several guests nodded politely. One even remarked that younger generations always brought fresh ideas. I gently set my coffee cup on the table. Traditions do evolve, I said calmly. The important question is whether they still reflect the values they were built upon. Vanessa smiled as though we completely agreed. Exactly. Families have to move forward. Daniel glanced between us, sensing a conversation beneath the words that he could not quite follow. Before anyone could continue, Harold cleared his throat. Mrs. Carter, he said pleasantly, you seem very invested in the family's future. Vanessa laughed. Well, someone has to think ahead. Indeed, Harold replied. Planning ahead has always been one of this family's greatest strengths. The conversation paused for only a heartbeat, yet I noticed Daniel studying Harold with growing curiosity. He clearly recognized that Harold was more than an ordinary guest, even if he could not place exactly how. That small shift mattered. Curiosity has a way of opening doors that certainty keeps closed. Dessert continued, but the atmosphere had changed almost imperceptibly. Vanessa remained confident, although I noticed her watching Benjamin's leather portfolio every few minutes. She had begun connecting pieces without understanding the picture. Benjamin, meanwhile, never once opened the case. He simply kept it beside his chair while participating in ordinary conversations about spring weather, local charities, and baseball season. The less he explained, the more mysterious his presence became. After a while, Daniel quietly approached me again. Mom, he asked, how long have you known Harold? I smiled gently. Longer than you have been alive. His eyebrows lifted slightly. I never realized that. There are many things you never had reason to ask about, I answered. He looked toward Harold, then toward Benjamin, before lowering his voice. Is there something happening that I should know? I met his eyes for several long seconds. I wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to explain every meeting Charles and I had attended, every document we had signed, every promise we had made to protect our family's future. But timing matters. Truth delivered too early often sounds like accusation instead of understanding. There will be a conversation soon, I said softly. When it happens, I hope you will listen before reaching conclusions. Daniel nodded slowly, although confusion remained written across his face. As he walked away, Vanessa immediately intercepted him, speaking quietly while glancing in my direction. He answered with a brief shake of his head, but whatever concern had begun forming inside him clearly had not disappeared. A few minutes later, Benjamin's phone vibrated. He read the message without changing his expression, then turned toward me. Mrs. Whitmore, he said in his usual calm voice, the final confirmation has arrived. Every trustee is present. They are prepared whenever you decide. Before I could respond, the church bell from across the street rang 4 slow chimes through the warm afternoon air, and at almost the exact same moment, Vanessa stood before the gathered family, tapped her glass gently with a dessert fork, and announced that she had a special surprise she wanted everyone to hear before the day came to an end. Vanessa waited until every conversation faded before lifting her glass with an expression that radiated confidence. Before everyone heads home, she said brightly, I wanted to thank all of you for supporting Daniel and me as we continue building the next chapter of the Whitmore family. Every generation eventually passes the torch, and I know Charles would have wanted us to carry his legacy forward with fresh ideas and new leadership. Several guests applauded politely. Others smiled with the comfortable certainty that they were hearing nothing more than a gracious holiday toast. Daniel forced a small smile beside his wife, although I could tell from the tension in his shoulders that he had not known she intended to say any of those words. He looked briefly toward me before lowering his eyes once again. Vanessa continued speaking with effortless confidence. Families thrive because each generation is willing to step aside and allow the next one to lead. I have been honored to help organize our traditions, and I hope everyone knows that our future is in good hands. Her words were carefully chosen. Nothing she said was openly disrespectful. Yet every sentence quietly suggested that the transition had already happened, that the family's foundation now rested beneath her direction. I noticed Harold Bennett exchange a brief glance with Benjamin Rhodes. Neither man reacted outwardly, but they had both heard the same implication. Around me, relatives nodded approvingly while complimenting Vanessa's dedication. One aunt even remarked that Charles would surely be proud to see such capable leadership. I simply folded my hands and listened. There is a remarkable difference between allowing someone to speak and agreeing with what they say. Vanessa finished her remarks by raising her glass. Here is to new beginnings. Crystal glasses touched gently across the patio. The applause lasted only a few seconds before conversations resumed. Daniel quietly stepped toward me while everyone became distracted collecting coats and handbags. "Mom," he whispered, "did that bother you?" I looked at him with the same calm expression I had carried all afternoon. "Do you believe leadership is something people announce about themselves?" He hesitated before answering. "No. Neither did your father." Daniel fell silent. I could almost see memories beginning to surface behind his eyes. Charles had never been the loudest voice in any room. He had earned respect through consistency, patience, and quiet decisions that protected others long before anyone realized protection was needed. Before Daniel could continue, Benjamin approached with measured steps. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "the trustees have gathered in the library exactly as requested." Daniel looked from Benjamin to me with visible confusion. "Trustees," he repeated. Benjamin smiled politely. "A brief administrative matter, nothing that will take very long." It was a truthful statement, although not a complete one. Daniel opened his mouth as though preparing another question, but Harold gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your father believed some conversations deserved the proper setting," Harold said. "You will understand soon enough." Daniel nodded slowly, uncertain whether to follow us or remain with the guests. That uncertainty lingered behind him as Benjamin and I quietly walked toward the front hallway. Halfway there, Lily caught my hand. "Grandma Eleanor, are you leaving already?" she asked with disappointment. I smiled and squeezed her fingers gently. "Only for a few minutes, sweetheart. I promised you I would always come back." She smiled with the simple trust only a child can give. As I continued toward the library, I heard Vanessa behind me telling several guests that Benjamin was helping me review some routine retirement paperwork. Her confidence returned almost immediately. She still believed every unexpected event fit comfortably inside the story she had created for herself. She had no reason to imagine that the library at the far end of the house contained the very people responsible for safeguarding the Whitmore family's future. We entered the quiet room where afternoon sunlight stretched across rows of books Charles had collected over 4 decades. Seated around the large walnut conference table were 5 trustees, each of whom had served the family foundation for years. Some had worked beside Charles. Others had joined after his passing. Every one of them stood respectfully as I entered. Daniel, unable to ignore his curiosity any longer, quietly followed us to the doorway. He stopped just outside the room, uncertain whether he belonged inside. Benjamin looked toward him and spoke gently. "You may come in, Daniel. It is time for you to understand why your father created all of this." Daniel stepped inside slowly, his eyes moving from one familiar face to another. Recognition gradually replaced confusion as he realized these were not casual family friends gathered by coincidence. Harold opened a leather folder and carefully placed several documents on the polished table. At the very top rested the original trust agreement bearing Charles Whitmore's signature beside my own. Daniel stared silently at the pages while the color slowly faded from his face. Before anyone had the chance to explain a single line, footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Vanessa's voice drew closer as she cheerfully told another guest, "I am sure whatever they are discussing concerns me too," just seconds before her hand reached for the library door. The library door opened slowly, and Vanessa stepped inside with the same effortless confidence she had carried throughout the afternoon. She smiled as though she expected to join another pleasant family conversation. "I hope I am not interrupting anything," she said brightly while glancing around the room. I noticed everyone disappearing one by one, and I thought perhaps I should be here as well. Benjamin Rhodes remained standing beside the walnut table without answering immediately. Harold Bennett quietly closed the library door behind her, not to trap anyone inside, but simply to keep the lively sounds of the Easter gathering from interrupting the discussion. Daniel looked from his wife to the documents spread across the table, then back toward me. The uncertainty in his face had become impossible to hide. Vanessa noticed it immediately. "Daniel," she said with a reassuring smile, "I am sure this is simply routine paperwork." She turned toward Benjamin. "I have been helping organize so many family matters lately that perhaps there is something you need from both of us." Benjamin folded his hands calmly. "Mrs. Carter, this meeting was requested by the trustees of the Whitmore Family Trust. Attendance was determined by the trust agreement many years ago." Vanessa nodded politely, still smiling. "Then I suppose I should sit down." Benjamin's expression remained courteous. "Not yet." The room grew noticeably quieter. Vanessa blinked once, clearly surprised by the response. "I do not understand." Harold slid one document toward Daniel. "Perhaps your father expected this day might eventually come," he said. "That is why he insisted every successor understand the trust before assuming anything about it." Daniel lowered his eyes and began reading the first page. I recognized the familiar language immediately. Charles and I had reviewed those same paragraphs dozens of times before signing them. Every sentence reflected careful planning rather than emotion. Across the table, Vanessa waited impatiently for someone to explain why she had not been invited to participate. "Surely this concerns the entire family," she finally said. Benjamin nodded. "It concerns the entire family. That is precisely why the trust exists." He carefully opened his portfolio and removed another sealed folder. The Whitmore Family Trust was established to preserve long-term stability, educational opportunities, charitable commitments, and responsible stewardship for future generations. Vanessa smiled again, although this time it appeared more cautious than confident. "That sounds wonderful." Benjamin continued without changing his tone. "The trust is administered by independent trustees. Operational authority remains subject to the trust protector appointed by the founders." Daniel looked up from the document. "Who is the trust protector?" he asked quietly. Benjamin did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned another page and gently rotated it toward Daniel. I watched my son's eyes move across the signatures at the bottom. His breathing slowed. His shoulders became perfectly still. After several long seconds, he whispered, "Mom?" No one else spoke. Daniel looked at me with an expression I had not seen since he was a young boy discovering something completely unexpected. "You are the trust protector?" I gave a small nod. "Your father believed someone needed to protect the principles we built together." Daniel looked back down at the papers, reading more carefully this time. Halfway through the page, another realization crossed his face. "These powers are still active," he said quietly. "They were never transferred." "No," Benjamin replied. "They were never intended to be transferred automatically." Across the room, Vanessa's smile disappeared for the first time all day. "I am sorry," she interrupted, "but I think there must be some misunderstanding. Charles passed away years ago." Naturally, family leadership moved to Daniel. Harold answered gently. "Family affection and legal authority are not always the same thing." Vanessa laughed nervously. "Well, regardless, Daniel and I have already been making decisions for everyone." Benjamin met her eyes politely. "You have been making social decisions. The governing authority established by the founders remains exactly where they intended it to remain." Silence settled over the library once again. Even Daniel appeared overwhelmed by what he was learning. He continued reading page after page while occasionally glancing toward me with growing disbelief. Finally, he looked up. "Mom, all major changes to the foundation, scholarship program, charitable grants, family property, and future trustee appointments require your written approval." "Yes," I answered softly. "That is correct." Vanessa instinctively took one slow step toward the table. "May I see those documents?" she asked. Benjamin placed one hand gently over the folder before she could reach it. "Certain sections are confidential until formally presented according to trust procedure." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Confidential from family?" Benjamin remained perfectly composed. "Confidential from anyone who does not hold a designated role under the agreement." The confidence that had carried Vanessa through the entire Easter celebration began to give way to uncertainty. For the first time since I had arrived that morning, she looked not at me as someone she believed she had replaced, but as someone she had never truly understood. Before anyone could say another word, Benjamin opened the final envelope inside his portfolio, revealing a single document marked for immediate review, and Harold quietly said, "Mrs. Whitmore, if you choose to exercise your authority today, the trustees are prepared to vote before this meeting ends." The room remained silent long after Harold finished speaking. No one rushed to fill the empty space. Some moments deserve quiet because they allow truth to settle before anyone tries to reshape it. I looked at the document Benjamin had placed before me but did not reach for the pen. My eyes moved instead to Daniel. He was still reading through the trust agreement, slower now, carefully studying every page that his father had signed years before. Occasionally he paused, as though recognizing familiar values hidden inside formal legal language. Charles had never wanted power concentrated in one person's hands. He wanted accountability. That had always been the purpose of the trust. Vanessa stood perfectly still across the table. The confidence that had carried her throughout the Easter celebration had faded into careful calculation. She looked first at Daniel, then at Benjamin, then finally at me. "I never knew any of this existed," she said quietly. It was the first completely honest sentence I had heard from her all afternoon. Benjamin answered with professional calm. "Very few people did." That was intentional. Vanessa folded her arms. "If this affects our family's future, why was Daniel never told?" Daniel looked up before anyone else could answer. "Because I never asked." His voice surprised even him. Dad always handled these things. After he passed away, I assumed everything had already been transferred. He looked toward me with unmistakable regret. "I never once sat down with you to understand what he spent his life building." I smiled gently. "Grief makes people assume many things. Your father understood that." Harold slid another folder toward Daniel. "Your father also wrote a letter to be opened only if this meeting ever became necessary." Daniel stared at the envelope bearing Charles Whitmore's handwriting. His fingers rested on it for several seconds before carefully opening the seal. The room became silent again while he read. His expression changed slowly, almost imperceptibly. First confusion. Then recognition. Finally sadness. When he finished, he lowered the letter without speaking. I did not ask what Charles had written. I already knew. We had written much of it together one quiet autumn evening after realizing that preserving a family's values required more than legal documents. Daniel finally lifted his eyes. He said leadership is measured by service, not position, he whispered. He said if I ever became more concerned about control than responsibility, I should stop and listen to Mom before making another decision. No one interrupted him. Across the room, Vanessa lowered her eyes for the first time that day. Outside the library, faint laughter from children floated through the open hallway, reminding me that Easter continued. Beyond these walls, life rarely pauses while families learn difficult lessons. Benjamin quietly placed another document beside me. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is the proposed resolution prepared by the trustees." I reviewed the first page carefully. It authorized several administrative changes designed to strengthen oversight of future trust decisions. Nothing in it punished anyone. Nothing removed Daniel from future responsibilities. Instead, it required additional trustee approval before major structural changes could be made and reaffirmed that the founding principles established by Charles and me could not be altered without unanimous consent. It was thoughtful, balanced, and exactly the kind of safeguard Charles would have supported. Halfway through reading, I noticed one additional paragraph that had not existed in earlier drafts. It reaffirmed that family members participating in trust governance were expected to demonstrate respect toward one another during official family functions because public conduct reflected directly upon the integrity of the foundation. I looked toward Benjamin. He met my eyes without speaking. The trustees had clearly observed everything that had happened during Easter. Vanessa noticed me lingering over the final page. Is that because of today? She asked carefully. Benjamin answered before I could. The trustees regularly review governance standards. Today's events reminded us why character matters. Vanessa slowly sat down for the first time since entering the library. She no longer looked defensive. She looked unsettled. Daniel quietly folded his father's letter and slipped it back into its envelope. "Mom," he said softly, "I owe you an apology. Not only for today. For years." I reached across the table and rested my hand gently over his. Understanding matters more than apologies. At that exact moment, Lily's cheerful voice echoed down the hallway. "Grandma Eleanor. We are taking one last family picture before everyone leaves." Her innocent excitement softened every face in the room. Harold smiled. Benjamin closed his portfolio. Even Daniel managed a small laugh through moist eyes. I picked up the pen Benjamin had placed beside the resolution and held it for a long moment. Every trustee quietly waited. Vanessa watched without saying a single word. Whether I signed that page exactly as written, revised it, or set it aside until another day would determine not only the future governance of the Whitmore family, but also whether today's painful lesson became the beginning of healing or the start of an even greater reckoning. I looked once more at the resolution resting on the polished walnut table before signing my name with the same fountain pen Charles had given me on our 25th wedding anniversary. The ink dried quietly across the page. There was no applause. No dramatic celebration. Real turning points rarely announce themselves with noise. They arrive in silence, when one thoughtful decision quietly changes everything that follows. Benjamin collected the signed document and passed it to Harold, who reviewed the final page before nodding with quiet satisfaction. "The resolution has been adopted unanimously," he said. "The founding principles remain fully protected, and the revised governance standards will become effective immediately." Daniel released a slow breath, as though he had been carrying a weight he had only just discovered. He looked toward me with an expression filled not with embarrassment but with understanding. "Dad trusted you because he knew you would never use authority to punish anyone," he said softly. I smiled. Authority that exists only to punish eventually destroys the very family it claims to protect. Vanessa remained seated for several long moments. She stared at the documents before finally lifting her eyes to meet mine. "Mrs. Whitmore," she began carefully, "I owe you an apology." Her voice lacked the polished confidence that had filled the dining room earlier that afternoon. It sounded quieter now, more honest. I convinced myself that organizing holidays and making decisions meant I had earned a place that was never mine to claim. I thought respect naturally followed responsibility, but I spent too much time trying to appear important instead of understanding what this family had already built long before I arrived. No one interrupted her. Apologies matter most when they are allowed to stand on their own. She continued after a brief pause. "I also embarrassed you today. There is no excuse for that. You deserved a place at the family table because you created the table all of us have been sitting around for years, whether I understood that or not." I watched her quietly before answering. "Respect cannot be demanded, Vanessa. It cannot be inherited through marriage, and it cannot be earned through appearances alone. It grows from consistent kindness, humility, and the willingness to honor people whose sacrifices made our lives possible." She nodded slowly, accepting every word without argument. Daniel stepped beside her and gently took her hand. "We both have work to do," he admitted. I allowed comfort to replace gratitude. I should have asked more questions. I should have listened more carefully. Most of all, I should never have allowed Mom to feel like a guest in her own family. His honesty reminded me so much of Charles that for just a moment I could almost imagine my husband standing beside the library window with that familiar patient smile. Benjamin closed his portfolio while Harold gathered the remaining documents. The meeting had accomplished everything it needed to accomplish. There had been no winners and no losers. There had only been truth, finally brought into the light. Lily suddenly appeared in the doorway, still carrying her little basket filled with colorful plastic eggs. "Everyone is waiting," she said with an excited grin. "We cannot take the last family picture without Grandma Eleanor." Daniel looked toward me and smiled. She is right. This time, no one suggested another table, another chair, or another place in the background. When we walked outside together, several relatives naturally stepped aside to make room for me at the center of the group. No announcement was made. No explanation was necessary. Sometimes people change their behavior not because they are told to, but because they finally understand what they had failed to see. Lily slipped her hand into mine while the photographer adjusted his camera. Vanessa approached quietly before the picture was taken. "Would you stand beside us?" she asked sincerely. "I would like my children to remember where this family truly began." I looked into her eyes and saw something I had not seen that morning. Not perfection. Not certainty. Simply humility. That was enough. I stepped beside Daniel, Vanessa, and Lily as the family gathered beneath the blooming magnolia tree. The afternoon sun settled softly across the garden Charles had loved so much. Just before the camera captured the moment, Lily squeezed my hand and whispered, "Grandma Eleanor, Grandpa Charles was right. The strongest roots really do stay hidden." I smiled as the shutter clicked because I finally understood that Charles had left us something far greater than wealth. He had left us the opportunity to choose character over pride, gratitude over entitlement, and unity over ego. The trust would continue protecting our family's future, but its greatest purpose had never been preserving money. Its greatest purpose had always been preserving the values worthy of passing from one generation to the next, and as we stood together that Easter afternoon, I believed for the first time in many years that the Whitmore family finally had a future worth protecting.